Doesn't this look kind of sketchy? As you probably guessed it, today we're playing with fire. Today we're gonna attempt making a knife using this old Sawblade. And if you follow me on Instagram, you already know that. Because on Instagram I posted a couple of different designs that I couldn't choose between. So I'll let you guys choose. So between these 4 options, it was a tie between the top and the bottom one. So I decided to go for the top one, but I made some slight modifications to it. So from this starting point, I decided to make the blade a little bit taller, the straight section a little bit longer, and the section where the blade meets the handle a little bit thinner. And if you're not yet, consider following me on Instagram for more behind the scenes stuff and updates along the way. And who knows, sometimes you might even get to decide what I build in these videos. So let me quickly walk you through how I'm planning to do this. I've got an old saw blade here that I'm going to use for the material for the knife. Now there's a lot of different information out there about making knives out of old saw blades. And generally you want the super old ones that are made up of only one material and not like this one that have the sharp teeth welded on out of a different material. You want the old saw blades because they have a better steel in the center here and also because they're already hardened. Meaning that you don't need to heat treat the blade after you finish shaping it. But that would also mean that I would have to shape the blade out of an already hard piece of metal, which I don't have the tools for. So the metal in this saw blade is soft enough that I can shape it with a file and sandpaper, and then I can deal with hardening it after the fact. But we'll talk more about that later. So the first step now will be to take this 1-to-1 printout, cut it out, glue it onto the saw blade, and then cut it out using an angle grinder. It's time to make some sparks. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's get started. Okay, look at this. This is already starting to look like a knife. So far it's been going really well. I cut it out with the angle grinder like I said, and then I used a couple of files to refine all the edges, especially in the inside here where I couldn't easily cut it out with the angle grinder. And then just as a quick test, I sanded both sides with my orbital sander. I was a little worried there for a second that I was gonna have some scratches in there from when it was used as a saw blade, but that all sanded out nicely. So now on to the probably most difficult part of this build. And that will be shaping the bevels on this knife. You see, right now it's the same thickness all the way across, which makes sense since it started as a saw blade. But we want it to be thinner at the very tip where it's going to do the cutting than on the back here. Normally you would do that with a belt grinder. I don't have a belt grinder, so I have to get a little bit creative. And that's why I've Frankenstein together this contraption. And what I'm hoping this assembly of random parts is going to help me do is shape that bevel on that blade. So this contraption consists of just a long metal rod with a file on the end of it that goes into an eye bolt at the end here. And all this does is that it allows me to hold the file at a consistent angle relative to this board right here. I'm thinking that I'll clamp the knife right there, and now I should, in theory, be able to file a bevel with a file without a belt grinder. In theory this should work, but it might end up taking way too much time. I won't know until I've tried, so I'm just gonna give it a shot. Oh, and I almost forgot, before I do any sort of grinding on the blade, I'm gonna color in the end of the blade here so that I can mark up where the center is so that I don't grind too much from either side. Okay, so as you can see, I switched from all the filing to this here machine. All that filing really did take forever, but I think it was a really good way of starting to shape this blade. Because of the way that setup worked, it was really easy to get a consistent angle all the way across the blade and also on both sides. Now that I have that established on both sides and we're starting to get a little bit closer to the final thickness on the tip here, I decided to give this little belt sander here a shot, and it seems to work out really well. Because now that I have this angle established, it's much easier for me to use that angle as a guide for when I'm using this little machine here. So I'm going to try out the belt sander, take it slowly, sand away a little bit more material until I have a thin enough edge at the end so I can sharpen it after heat treat. Right on, so we're really starting to get somewhere with this knife. Using the sander definitely made it a lot easier to remove material, although it was quite challenging to keep the angle perfectly flat. So what I originally wanted with this knife, having a perfectly flat taper, now turned into a little bit more of a convex taper, meaning that the sides bow slightly going in towards the edge. Right now though, I want to take my orbital sander and give this entire thing a once over, shape and define all the edges a little bit more before we then get ready to heat treat the blade. So after quite a bit of filing and sanding, I am now finally happy with the shape of this blade. I gave all the edges here a little bit of a round over, as well as the inside here, so it should be nice and comfortable to handle. So before we move on to heat treating this blade, I want to tackle the handle. And that brings me to the material I'm going to use, which is this thing right here. So this piece right here is a piece of a super old handrail from an old building in Oslo. The building itself was probably around 100 years old when this was installed, and the tree it came from probably was well over 100. It's a shame to see big old trees chopped down like they did in those days, but given that this piece was probably just going to be thrown away if I hadn't taken it, I'm really happy that I have it because now we can give it some new life. So I'll start by chopping a piece of this off, and then we can see what hides underneath all this old stuff that's on here. Just gotta move away this little zoo of animals here that's collected on the bandsaw. If you haven't seen it yet, check out my previous video where I show you how to make these. I've cut down the piece of mahogany to a little bit more of a manageable size, something a bit closer to what the final shape of the handle will look like. And now we can see how beautiful this old piece of wood is. Now, as you might remember from the drawings, I want this handle to be a two-tone handle. The majority of the handle being this mahogany and the front section being a much darker type of wood. Now, I don't have any darker wood right now, but what I do have is this piece of birch, which I dropped into a cup of black wood dye overnight, which after drying it out for a little bit, now looks like this. And I've even cut a little slice off of it, and it looks like it's colored mostly all the way through. So that's a good thing, because now we're going to start fitting these two pieces onto the blade. So while the glue on the handle is drying up, let's talk about hardening the blade. And to do that, we're going to build a charcoal forge. Well then, so after all that cutting, grinding, and filing on that knife blade, you might be asking yourself why I just carried in a bag of sand. Well, actually, it is just that is the problem. Not the bag of sand, but the fact that we've been cutting, grinding, and filing on that knife blade. You see, the fact that we now can file the blade with relative ease is going to be an issue in the end. Because if the finished knife is going to be soft enough to file, it's also not going to be able to hold an edge very well. So therefore, we need a way to make the blade harder. And what does a bag of sand, some plaster, a baking tray, and a metal pipe meant to hang clothes on have to do with making our knife harder? You see, in order to make our blade harder, we need to heat it up in a process called hardening. Hardening is the process of heating up the metal until it's glowing red hot and then quickly dipping it in oil to cool it down. That will make the metal much harder and way more suitable for a knife. So I'm going to use what I've learned in another YouTube video, which I'll link down below, to build a small charcoal forge. And I'll make that forge using the oven tray, drilling a hole into the side of it, using the metal pipe, drilling a series of holes down the length of it, and then inserting it into the side of the oven tray. We're going to then mix up a mixture of plaster and sand, and then build sort of like an insulated fire pit looking thing with the steel pipe in the middle, on top of which we're going to light some charcoal on fire, and then we're going to use the holes in the steel pipe to blow some air through to make everything really hot. So I'll just get started with this. If you want to learn more about this process, watch the YouTube video linked down below, and you'll see how this turns out in just a second. So here it is, it's finished. It's had a couple of days to dry out, so it's ready to go. I've got a bag of coals. We're gonna set this thing up outside, light a fire, and then we're gonna use this hole and a hairdryer to make the coals really hot. And then hopefully we'll be able to heat up this blade. All right, join me outside and we'll make a fire. Well, I do live in Norway, so it is super cold. Let's get this fire started. So far so good. The coals are nice and hot. I've just added a little bit more on top. And the trick with the hairdryer to blow air in works really well. Just watch. Look how quickly it gets really hot. Oh, it sure is nice to have something warm when it's so cold outside. So my plan now is to put the knife into the coals, let this thing get nice and glowing red hot, and then I've got a container of granola oil behind me that we'll use to quench the blade, hopefully hardening it in the process. All right, here goes nothing. Oh boy, I really did a number on this thing. Yikes. Okay, story time. Here's what happened. All went well, the forge works great. First, I heated up the blade until it was glowing red. Pulled it out of the coal, quenched it, and all seemed to be well. Once it cooled down, I then checked it with a file to see if it was properly hardened. I felt that it wasn't quite hardened enough. The file was still cut into the metal a little bit. So I thought I probably just need to heat it up a little bit more and then quench it again. So tried the whole thing again, poured some more coal on it, full speed on the hairdryer. The thing got really hot, and the thing got really hot. I partially melted the entire tip of the blade, which now has, I think, like a lump of coal melted into the tip. I also managed to heat up this area right here so much that when I pulled it out and went to quench it, the whole thing bent and had like a good 20-degree kink into it. So I had to heat the whole thing up once again. This is now the third time that I'm heating up this thing. First I only heated up this area, tried to bend it straight. It seemed to have worked pretty well. But at that point, once I got it warm enough again, quenched it, this time without burning off any more material. But at this point, this is a pretty sad sight. So this is definitely not going to be the knife that I envisioned it to be, but we can't give up now. I've already spent way too much time on this. So I'm gonna carefully start grinding on this thing, see what I can save, see how it looks like underneath all of this really rough scaling on here. And yeah, then we'll see. Okay, let's talk about what just happened. So this is the knife, and against all odds, we finished it. We were very close to melt away our whole project there for a little second, but I just about managed to still get a knife out of it. So a very quick recap of what you just watched. I was able to grind away most of the weird stuff that happened during our failed heat treat attempt. As a result of this, the entire knife did get a little bit smaller in every direction basically, not only in length and height, but also in thickness, so it's now a very thin knife. I decided to leave some of the imperfections from the heat treat still visible. I guess that is kind of to show off the journey this knife has been through and what I've learned during this process. That is also the reason why, when I discovered that the ink hadn't completely colored through the piece of birch here, I decided to leave that in and kind of embrace it as a feature of this handle. And after sanding the blade and shaping the handle, I glued them both together using epoxy. And now that everything is dry, I've also sharpened it. I guess we should see how sharp it is. And what better piece of paper to use than our old template of what the knife was supposed to look like. So. Yes, absolutely, it is sharp. It is very sharp. And it also seems to hold the edge pretty well. Worth mentioning, I also tempered the blade, which means I had it in the oven for a couple of hours to make it less brittle. And all in all, despite, let's call it a very unfortunate event of me almost melting this blade, I am really happy with how the knife turned out. I learned a ton, and I actually had a lot of fun building this. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, please give it a like. And if you want to see more videos of mine, maybe some of which where I don't accidentally almost melt my entire project, I suggest checking out some of the other videos I've made. Maybe this one where I'm making wooden animals using only the bandsaw. So it's time for me to raid the fridge and see what I have in there that I can use to put this knife to test. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye! I found a lot of carrots. Now what? Thanks for watching.